The lady from Alabama, Senator Britt, for her first hearing is recognized.
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the ranking member for your warm welcome today at my very first hearing. It is certainly an honor to be on this committee, and I look forward to being a very productive and active part of it. So thank you. So my first question is for Mr. Dietz or Dr. Dietz. We know the Biden administration has actually put in more rules and regulations in the first 2 years of their administration than Obama did in 8. When we look at that, it undoubtedly contributes to inflation and to stifled economic growth across the board, and I believe the housing sector is no exception to that. I understand the regulations add cost to building homes, 25% of the cost of constructing a single-family home and 40% of a multi-family home due to regulations. So I know that you face regulations both at a state and a local level, and I wanted to know if you could share some of those existing regulations that are really driving up cost for home buyers.
Yeah, I think a good example at the federal level is the Waters of the U.S. rule, which is both confusing but adds costs, makes it difficult to bring land to market, takes longer, provides a lot of money for consultants to do studies, but provides that uncertainty during the land development process that can take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. At the local level, we already talked about zoning rules, but you also have rising impact fees, delay requirements. Just the delay itself of getting land approved, construction projects approved, all of that results in higher rents and higher home prices. So if we're really serious about tackling housing affordability, we need to find ways to reduce the red tape and bring homes to market faster.
Absolutely. Well, given those hurdles, can you tell me, is it harder, single-family homes, multifamily homes, who have been impacted more by this ultimately?
Well, if you listen to builders enough, which I do, I travel across the country a lot, they will say all of us, right? It's not necessarily a competition. They're all sort of challenging in their own ways. Multifamily, it's more density issues. With single family, it's concerns about land supply and lot development. With remodeling, it's the skilled labor shortage. But if we're looking at low-hanging fruit to improve the availability of housing in the country, reducing housing regulatory costs is a big way to get there.
And you're saying home buyers across the board are impacted?
Yeah, I probably disproportionately affects first-time buyers, first-generation buyers, because again, that entry-level construction, that townhouse construction is difficult too. That sort of light-touch density, but generally speaking, it is driving up the cost of all forms of housing.
So it's people that want to start the American dream that are being stifled by this. So the past 2 years, inflationary policies of the Biden administration have compounded the naive belief that the inflation would be transitory. We've seen it hit us everything from groceries to gas, and obviously home buying is no exception to that. The past year alone, the Federal Reserve has raised the Federal Reserve fund rates nearly 5 percentage points, and that's materially impacted the price of housing, driving up borrowing cost and monthly mortgage cost to the average American home buyer. What is your outlook of the housing demand, and how does that impact the expected housing construction in the next, I'd say, what do we see in the next 2 years, maybe 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, right now we're in a bit of a downturn, as Dr. Herbert talked about. Our expectation is that single-family construction and multifamily construction are likely to decline this year. But we see a turning point ahead for single-family home building. In fact, after 12 straight months of decline for builder sentiment that we measure each month, we actually got an uptick in January. So I think in the short run, we're going to see some stabilization. And then 2025 through 2030, if we can just get the regulatory burdens out of the way, 2025 through 2030 will be a pretty good runway for home building growth, because we've got to reduce that structural housing deficit that's in place, that shortage.
Absolutely. And as we talk, obviously, about the home building, I think it's important to make sure that people can get access to capital, that they can be financed. Is there anything you can tell us about the status of the loan market, or anything that the committee needs to consider to make sure that capital is available for these people who want to achieve the American dream?
Yeah, this is where we don't see enough focus. I think when we talk about lending and loans in housing, we're typically thinking about mortgages on the demand side. But keep in mind, about 2/3 of home construction is undertaken by smaller builders, and they get their capital by going to community banks and borrowing funds. So we call that acquisition, development, and construction lending. And one of the things we know about the business cycle is that particular market tightens when we go into a downturn. So the concern is We see mortgage interest rates begin to settle back, a turning point comes in view, but builders and land developers can't get access to credit. So there's a lot of different ideas in terms of how to address some of those challenges. One would be extending the secondary market that currently exists for purchase mortgages over to builder and construction loans, and that would help reduce some of the cost of credit and make sure that capital is available, particularly in, I would say, like rural markets where it's more difficult to obtain that kind of lending for builders.
Alabama's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today. Before we start talking about sanctions, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. In 2021, the U.S. Department of Agriculture noted that foreign investors now owned over 40 million acres of our farmland. This has occurred since 2015 at a tune of about 2.2 million acres a year. I've heard from many Alabamians as I've traveled across the state, and this is a concern for them, specifically the Chinese Communist Party and their willingness and their efforts and deliberate and intentional attempts to buy up fertile U.S. farmland. I believe food security is national security. Food security is economic security. So I believe that 1 acre of our farmland owned by the Chinese Communist Party is 1 acre too many. Additionally, I think there's another layer of national security concerns that we're allowing China to buy up farmland near our military installations. It is completely and totally unacceptable. So my question, Mr. Lowry, for you as a former chair of CFIUS, when it comes to ensuring we have a strong agriculture voice at the table when these decisions are being made, do you agree that it's reasonable that the Secretary of Agriculture should be involved as a member of CFIUS?
I think it is totally reasonable, yes. And as I mentioned earlier, if the CFIUS needed to bring in agriculture right now, they can do it on an ad hoc basis. But to the point that you've made and a number of senators have made, it sounds to me like this probably should be looked at in a more systematic way.
Yes, we need a permanent seat at the table because it is absolutely unacceptable. When you look, I believe, probably say with great confidence that the Chinese Communist Party is not allowing the United States of America to buy up their farmland, particularly near their military installations. So on that line of questioning, under CFIUS, it's almost always national security agreements. They're issued instead of outright blocking foreign companies from acquiring U.S. companies or engaging in transactions that are assessed to have these national security implications. We issue these agreements first. And my question to you is how does CFIUS enforce a national security agreement? And what are the consequences for failing to adhere to the terms of those agreements?
So if you look at most of the numbers about CFIUS reviewed in 2021, which is last year, we have 275 transactions. Of those 275 transactions, about 10% of them, roughly 30 transactions, had what you just described, mitigation agreements. So that means basically that the government had concerns about the transaction, but they thought the transaction could go through, but they wanted to make sure that there are specific measures put in place to protect national security potentially in the future. Those national security agreements can last for a long time. They are implemented and negotiated by specific agencies that have the right type of expertise. So if it's a military type of issue, the Department of Defense will negotiate it. If it's something on information technology issues, most likely the Department of Justice or maybe Homeland Security will do it. They follow these agreements up through monitoring mechanisms, auditing mechanisms from third-party auditors. And if there are violations of the mitigation agreements, they do have the capability to, one, obviously step in and do something, including they could actually divest the transaction way after the fact, or more likely, they could do something like they could do a fine, they could do warnings to basically see, kind of make sure you get your house in order type of problem. So that's kind of how it works. And I think there's roughly about 200 mitigation agreements from past that are in effect. Every now and then, some of them roll off because there may be somebody else who comes in and purchases it who's a domestic buyer. Okay,
so question actually for each of you. During your time in government, were there violations of these mitigation agreements? Just yes or no?
No, but there weren't the same enforcement authorities that were created after I left in 2018.
Okay.
So I can't properly answer.
Okay.
There were violations that we noticed when I was there, just like Kevin said, that some of this has become tougher over time, but they have been violation of the agreements, and usually they were worked out through mechanisms of, they weren't egregious violations is probably the best way. There were violations and there are things that happen that are just mistakes, right? And so the parties usually would work that out with the agency that was in charge, who would report it back to the overall CFIUS committee to make sure that everybody was aware.
Okay.
I don't recall, much like Mr. Lowry just said, I don't recall intentional egregious violations, but I do believe mistakes were made that had to be corrected.
Okay. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Senator Britt. Senator Kramer of North, Senator Britt, Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, it's great to have you here today. Over the past 2 years, we've seen the highest inflation of my lifetime, driving up costs for American families across the board. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, the annual inflation rate in 2021 was 7%, and in 2022, it was 6.5%. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the cost of food went up 10% in 2022. And the real effects of that is moms and dads across this nation that are working to put food on the table for their kids, for their babies, had a harder time doing that. This has devastated hardworking Americans, causing a kitchen table crisis in every corner of our country, as the price of food, energy, and housing have all skyrocketed. In response, the Federal Reserve has raised the Federal Reserve Fund rate more than 4 percentage points. Being far from transient, inflation has remained persistent, high, and well above the Fed's long-run goal of remaining under 2%. In the coming year, what factors and indicators are you paying attention to as you and the Federal Open Market Committee decide on whether to increase rates?
So I'd say a couple things to that. First, we're going to be looking at inflation in the 3 sectors that I mentioned: the goods sector, the housing sector, and then the broader service sector. And we need the inflation that's already underway in the goods sector to continue, and that's really important. In the housing sector, we just need the time to pass so that reported inflation comes down, and it's effectively in the pipeline as long as new leases are being signed at relatively small increases. So we'll be watching very, very carefully, though, at the larger service sector, which is 56% of consumer spending, and more than that of what's currently inflation. So that's one thing we'll be watching that very carefully. Also, we raised rates very quickly last year, and we know that if monetary policy, tightening policy, has delayed effects. It takes a while for the full effects to be seen in economic activity and inflation. So we're watching carefully to see those effects come into play. So we're aware that we haven't seen the full effects yet, and we're taking that into account as we think about rate hikes.
So when you're looking at this, obviously not to get into a policy discussion, but if there were an increase of energy production in this country, do you feel like that would help drive down inflation?
Well, I think over time, more energy would mean lower energy prices. But we are very focused on what we call core inflation, because that is what is driven by, really by demand, and our tools are really aimed at demand.
Right, understood. But I feel like the cost of energy is not just what you pay at the pump. It ends up affecting every good across this great nation. Additionally, I'd like to ask you about labor participation. So when you look at the unemployment rate, and we've heard my colleagues discuss people having to be displaced in order for us to maybe get to the inflation rate that we would like as a nation, I'd like to focus on the labor participation rate. So right now it's 62.4%. If there were an increase in people coming back into the workforce, would that be a positive factor with regards to driving us down to the 2% rate that you would want to achieve?
I think that it would. I mean, remember those people coming into jobs. Yes. That would be great, because the economy clearly wants more people than are currently working. Of course, those people would then spend more, so it wouldn't be a zero-sum game. But it would be great for the country and great for them if they were to come into the labor force.
Amen. I believe that increasing in capital requirements on financial institutions would have a chilling effect on the economy and the availability of financial services. And last week, I joined many of my colleagues in sending you a letter that expressed concerns that if the Federal Reserve decides to conduct a, quote, holistic review of capital standards, as we heard Senator Scott talk about earlier. So is the Federal Reserve concerned that the impact to the economy of increasing capital requirements on financial institutions at a time when inflation remains persistently high would cause an issue?
So I think it's always a balance. We know that higher capital makes banks safer and sounder. We also know that you will, at the margin, provide less credit the more capital you have to have. But I think it's never exactly clear that you're at the perfect equilibrium, and it's a fair question, I think, to look at that.
And I know out of respect for the chairman and trying to stay in my time, I will just end by saying I heard what you said. Obviously, as you have said, the Federal Reserve is not and will not be a climate policymaker. I just want to thank you for your public statement on that. I agree with you that there's a difference between policymakers and financial regulators, and certainly look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks, Senator Britt.
The second vote has been called for anyone who wants to go vote. I am going to go vote. I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Peters, and Senator Britt, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Mr. General, for being in front of us today. I appreciate the topics that have been brought up, from drug cartels to Mexico and the DEA to the fentanyl poisoning communities all across this nation to drug use and addiction. I stand ready to be a productive part of those conversations and work to move our nation forward, keeping our communities safe and strong. Mr. General, I want to ask you about some questions when you testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee a couple of weeks ago. I am a big believer, and I've heard this all over the state of Alabama as I've traveled. People want justice to be blind. They believe that is a foundational building block of our nation, and until we restore that trust and confidence, people are worried about the direction our nation will go. So you testified several weeks ago before the Senate Judiciary Committee and fielded a number of questions from committee members regarding DOJ's failure to prosecute any individuals who were involved in the illegal protest outside the homes of multiple Supreme Court justices in the aftermath of the leaked Dobbs opinion. As you are well aware, 18 U.S.C. 1507 makes it a crime to picket or parade near a residence occupied by a judge. It says, with the intent of influencing any judge, juror, witness, or court officer in the discharge of his duty. In answering the questions from multiple members of the committee, you repeatedly asserted that DOJ's failure to bring any charges under Section 1507 was due to the fact that the U.S. Marshals who were protecting the homes of the justices failed to make any arrest under that statute. You said, quote, the marshals have been advised and they know, and the marshals on the ground, they have full authority to arrest people under any federal statute, including that federal statute, end quote. That was in direct reference to Section 1507. You went on to say, the Attorney General does not decide whether to arrest. The marshals on the scene, they do make the decision of whether to arrest. After your appearance before the Judiciary Committee, we obtained copies of the slide deck that was used to train and prepare the marshals for their protective detail at the homes of the justices. Those training materials show that the marshals likely didn't make any arrest under Section 1507 for a pretty simple reason. They were actively discouraged from doing so. As you can see on the slide behind me, the marshals were explicitly told to avoid, unless absolutely necessary, any criminal enforcement action involving the protester. The slides went on to say, they explicitly state that making arrest and initiating prosecutions was not the goal of the marshals' presence at the homes of the justices, and the not was actually italicized and underlined. The next slide directs the marshals not to engage in protest-related enforcement actions beyond those that were strictly and immediately necessary and tailored to ensure the physical security of the justices. If you'll see in the next slide here, it discourages the marshals from making arrest under any Section 1507 by asserting that there may be a First Amendment right to harass the families of the judges, and by concluding that any arrest of protesters are a last resort to prevent physical harm of the justices. Mr. Attorney General, yes or no, were you at any point before your testimony in front of the Judiciary Committee aware of these training materials or the fact that the marshals had been heavily discouraged from making arrests under Section 1505?
I think this is the first time I've seen this slide deck, and frankly, from here, I can't make it out, for which I apologize for my eyesight, but I can't make it out. What I said before was correct. Their first and principal job is to protect the lives and property of the members of the court. And as I said at the time, first Attorney General who's ever ordered the marshals to protect the residences of the justices and to protect them 24/7.
Yes.
That's their principal responsibility. But that doesn't mean that they are in any way precluded from bringing other kinds of arrests.
So thank you so much, Mr. Attorney General. I do have another question for in a few moments, but when you say they were given the full authority to arrest people violating Section 1507, I would ask, will you take a look at these slides, these materials, dig into them? It is clear that these marshals were given directives that narrowed the scope. Of course, we all want the physical safety. The physical safety of our Supreme Court justice is paramount, and we thank you for sending those marshals there. 1507, though, actually is more all-encompassing than that narrowly tailored objective. And it says picketing or parading near a building or housing if you're doing it with the intent to interfere with, obstruct, or impede the administration of justice or influencing any judge in the discharge of his duty. It's clear when you look at these slides that the marshals were not given those directives. I would like for you to take a look at that. And if you agree with that statement, I'd like for you to amend your testimony to the Judiciary Committee.
Well, there's nothing for me to amend because, as I said, I've never seen those slides before.
I know I need to yield my time. It's clear the marshals were given a different directive, and I would ask you to look into that, please.
I will.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Britt. Attorney General Garland, good to see you here today, and thank you for your...
Senator Britt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a couple more questions. Did want to echo what Senator Hyde-Smith said. Obviously, our state was ravaged by storms in January, and your team was on the ground, particularly Deputy Administrator Hooks, who did an excellent job. We still have a long road to recovery, but certainly appreciate the important work that FEMA does. Also, in addition to following up on a couple of things, I wanted to see if there's an opportunity to get a commitment from you on a few different items that I think are outstanding and some of which would be very helpful as we work to navigate this journey forward. So the President announced that Title 42 will end on May 11th, and the Department's own projections, as we've discussed here today, are that encounters will double from today's level to as many as 12,000 encounters daily. Despite multiple requests, the Department has not provided details of how it will handle that expected surge. Can you make sure to commit to us that you will provide that information? Is there a plan in place currently? And if so, can we have that by April 12th in 2 weeks?
Oh, Senator, we can get that plan to you very quickly. We published its first iteration in September of 21. We updated the plan in April of 22. We have added to it through the programs that we announced on January 5th. We have our notice of proposed rulemaking. So I'd be very pleased to get you those materials. Thank you also for, again, commending Deputy Administrator Hooks. I passed on your compliment to him, and he was very, very appreciative and touched. It meant a lot to him and to all of us.
Well, thank you. Similarly, the department has failed to provide responses to a number of requests from this committee, several of which were required under the FY23 omnibus. In particular, the first report on how the department plans to spend the $1.8 billion in FY23 border funds. It was due 6 weeks ago. We did receive that yesterday, so that's convenient that we were able to wrap that up right before today. But the next report is due in 2 weeks. Will you commit to having the department provide these reports on time as required by law?
Ranking Member Britt, I assure you that we will use our best efforts to respond to the letters we receive very promptly as possible, and to submit the reports as required by law. I do want to say, because our personnel, a few of whom are seated behind me, are working almost 24/7 to be as responsive as possible to Congress. The one recommendation of the 9/11 Commission that has not been implemented is a refinement of the number of committees of jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security. I cannot overstate the number of letters that we receive, and that is the responsibility of Congress to probe us, and so I don't shrink from that. The number of letters that we receive on a daily basis, the number of reports that we have to complete, we are doing our mightiest.
And Mr. Secretary, we are as well. As we work to get back to regular order and we make important decisions, it's important for us to have that information so that we can move forward fully.
We will move with great speed.
Yes, and lastly, in this same line of questioning, what are you doing to deal with the 600,000 people who have come over, migrants who have come over that have been paroled into the United States? I know we've looked at this. The department has yet to provide a plan on how you're going to tackle that. And I wanted you to see if you could tell us kind of how you plan to move forward with that.
With respect to individuals who've been paroled into the United States, they are they should be in immigration enforcement proceedings. And if their claims succeed, then they are provided relief under our laws. If their claims fail, then they will be issued an order of removal, and we will seek to remove them from.
I am concerned about that backlog. Can you commit to an open dialogue between your senior staff and my team to make sure that we are up to date on that?
Most certainly.
Okay. And lastly, I will just end with, you said specifically that the prior threat has not gone away when it comes to terrorism abroad and what we've seen in Afghanistan, both previously and now. We know that under the Biden administration, we've seen 1.2 million gotaways at our border. And we know that that threat is real. And I want to reiterate my concern. President Biden said himself that budgets are statements of value. I value the work that this department can and should and will be doing. And I hope that we see that same commitment from the administration as well. By saying it was wonderful to see Senator Fetterman here today. As a friend and a freshman colleague, it's great to have him back both in this committee room and here in the Capitol. Thank you for appearing before this committee today. We appreciate your time and your intentionality in answering our questions. I believe that this committee's role is that of oversight, and it's essential for holding leaders in our executive departments accountable for the decisions they make and policies they promote that affect all Americans, whether it be in our housing programs or our macroeconomic policies. America has seen inflation increase by 15.4% since President Biden came into office. As a mom of 2 school-aged kids, I see this firsthand every time I go to the grocery store or to the gas pump. Groceries are up 20% and energy costs are up 36%. Families in Alabama, South Carolina, Ohio, and in every community across the country are feeling that pain. Rising prices have cost that typical households, it's about $10,000 in 2 years. Families, parents, and retirees have had to bear the brunt of that persistent inflation over these last 23, 24 months. Dr. Bernstein, I wanted to talk to you following up on what Senator Kennedy was asking you. I know you've been asked once, but I want to make sure that we can clarify this. Do you still stand by your past comments indicating that inflation is transitory?
The problem with the word transitory is that it's become, I think, an unhelpful and much too ambiguous term to describe the trajectory of inflation. It is true that that word or any other word, temporary, any synonym, suggests a condition where inflation accelerates and then inflation decelerates. It slows down. Now, inflation peaked at 9% in June, and most recently was seen at 5%. That's its lowest annual growth rate since November of 2021. So in that sense, the view of acceleration then deceleration was correct. Transitory, however, was too temporarily, too temporally ambiguous a term.
Okay, so you do agree that that term should not have been used?
I think that the term was far too ambiguous to give people a clear sense of what we were thinking.
Yeah, and so one of the things we need you to do as a leader and someone who advises is give the public very clear indications of what we can expect. Unfortunately, the word transitory for many means temporary. It means that it would be short-lived. That's certainly not what we've seen. We've seen inflation above 5% every single month for 23 straight months, and real wages have gone down for 2 straight years. One of the things that Chairman Brown said about you and that was indicated in the letter is that you are open to changing your mind. So once again, just want to directly ask, that word transitory should have never been used.
I don't want to say it should never have been used. I think that the word is not a helpful term. I think it's too ambiguous. I think it doesn't clearly, it does not clearly delineate either what we believe to be the case or the actual trajectory. Now, that said, it is true that we saw inflation accelerate and we've seen inflation cool, but we have a lot more to go.
Would you agree that it's lasted longer than you anticipated when you first used that term?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bernstein, you've also championed massive spending packages pushed by President Biden over these last 2 years, the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. You publicly said that they would decrease inflation. The hard truth is that these bills and policies have increased inflation, and the result in some saying that we may be having to have a recession in order to stem inflation. More spending is not the answer. To lower costs for all Americans, we have to stop the reckless spending, reduce regulatory burdens on job creators, and unleash American energy production so that we are not just energy independent, but energy dominant. President Biden has nominated you for the position of the chair of Council of Economic Advisors, of which you currently serve as a member of the council. 72% of Americans believe that the economy is headed in the wrong direction. And as one of the architects of the past 2 years of the failing economic policies of this administration, it is concerning to me that President Biden is asking the Senate to confirm you to this position. Last month, we saw President Biden propose his budget for fiscal year 2024 that includes a $6.9 trillion tax and spending spree that we know will continue to drive inflation even higher. All we have to do is look over the past 2 years for the evidence of that. I would ask you, how can the American people expect different results when this administration and its economic advisors tend to look like they're doubling down on what I believe has not worked?
So thank you for the question, Senator. I respectfully would like to challenge some of the ways you've teed up some issues there. So first of all, the rescue plan was actually fiscally smaller than the CARES Act. So if that was massive, then the CARES Act was even more massive. The Inflation Reduction Act more than pays for itself. It actually reduces the budget deficit by over $200 billion over 10 years. In terms of the budget, the president's budget, once again, that not only pays for the proposals in the budget, but reduces the deficit by almost $3 trillion over 10 years. So I think that those characterizations go in a different direction than some that you were suggesting, respectfully.
And respectfully, I would disagree. I think if we were be producing more energy, if we were to be spending less money, I think inflation would not have been as quote-unquote transitory as you first put forth.
So if I may, Senator, the production of crude oil under President Biden is the highest.
I heard you say that earlier.
Is the highest under any president on record. In fact, under President Biden, on average, the production is 560,000 barrels per day, greater than under the previous administration.
And we see what's happening in Europe and the UK, and you've referenced that earlier. And if we were doing more to help them with their energy needs, I think that we would see those costs go down as well.
Thanks, Senator Britt. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our nominees for being here today. So the sudden failure...
I want to start by thanking Senator Lankford. Thank you for putting this together and for your continued leadership on this important issue. I also want to thank Senator Blackburn, Senator Ernst, and Senator Cornyn for giving me the opportunity to see this tragedy firsthand. So I went to the border 3 times so far in my tenure in the United States Senate. I want to put that in perspective for you. So I went 3 times in 2 months, whereas Joe Biden has only been 3 hours in 2 years. And when we went, we asked for the real, unvarnished truth. And what I am here to tell you is that we have a humanitarian and a national security crisis at our border every single day.
As a mom, it was gut-wrenching to watch women pregnant attempt to cross the border with multiple tiny children behind them. To look into the eyes of our CBP agents who said, look, I pulled a woman from this very river last week who was pregnant with twins. She drowned. As a mom, to sit across from a young woman who told me it wasn't that she was raped every day, it was how many times a day she was raped at the hands of the drug cartels. As I've traveled the great state of Alabama, sitting across from a parent who told me he lost his son to fentanyl poisoning. When in the world is this administration going to wake up? We must seal and secure our border, put back in policies that just make sense and that keep Americans safe and our communities strong. Listen, what we are about to see happen over the next few days is going to be catastrophic, but it is nothing that we didn't know was coming. On January 26th, Joe Biden came out and said, we are ending the public health emergency and Title 42 on May 11th. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this timeline, because then on March 9th, he came out with his budget that cut the Department of Homeland Security by 1%. Now, let me tell you something. President Biden wasn't afraid of increasing things when he thought they needed to be, because he increased EPA by 19%. That decrease made it even more challenging to secure our border, to combat fentanyl, and to make sure that we put these traffickers in their place and enforce our existing immigration laws. There is no doubt that it is open season for human traffickers, drug cartels, and terrorists. I plead with the administration, the men and women behind me and in this building, we have real solutions. Come to the table. Let's secure our border. Let's put the American people first. Let's put the safety of our children and communities all across this country before anything else. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here today and appearing before this committee. It's unfortunate that the policies of this administration have shifted what was a thriving economy just a few years ago to an environment of economic uncertainty and unprecedented inflation. Today, individuals, businesses, and lenders are all facing the challenges of the current high interest rates. We are seeing that in our daily lives across the board. Despite this, banks in my state of Alabama have remained resilient, and I am so proud to be able to say that. At the same time, that cannot be said of the banks that are represented sitting before us. Mr. Becker, I'm concerned with the lack of responsibility that you have chosen to take for the role that you played leading up to the failure of the bank that you led for the last 12 years. While your written testimony points to a number of issues that you believe are responsible, I think the answer to the question of what happened to your bank lies in the first sentence of the Federal Reserve's 118-page report. It states Silicon Valley Bank failed because of a textbook case of mismanagement by the bank. Mr. Becker, I believe that good management starts from the top. Given that you've spoken and spent the last 30 years really immersed in the banking industry and in this profession, you were actually CEO of this bank that grew to the country's 16th largest bank. So I think we can all agree that you're an expert in this field. Given your level of expertise in the banking industry, coupled with your longstanding familiarity with SVB and the individual client base, the risk controls, and the investments, it's hard to understand a scenario where you were unable to predict or see, or at least proactively consider what the impact of the changing economic environment would have on your client base and investment portfolio. Let me ask you this. At what point did you begin to see red flags with regards to the long-term stability of your bank?
So, Senator, when the two questions, right? So capital liquidity, as I think about it, our capital was very strong all the way up until you can look at, March 10th. And so that was validated by the regulators in several points. Liquidity is the other question. And so when you looked at 22, clearly our clients were impacted by the economy and rising rates.
So when did you see a red flag?
we saw in the first quarter of 22 would have been when we started to see a slowdown because of the increase in interest rates with our client base.
So tell me, what did you do wrong? In reflection, looking back over the last 5 years, and particularly the last 3, what could you have done differently to prevent this from happening?
Senator, I've thought about your question, especially over the last 8 weeks, pretty much every day. And, you know, it's amazing. I mean, hindsight, we can look at the fastest rate rise
Absolutely,
in 4 years.
and that's what I'm asking you to do. In hindsight, what could you have done differently? We can have the best quarterback in the entire country win a Super Bowl. He even goes back and he dissects film to see when he should have stayed in the pocket longer, when he should have moved here. Everyone does this, especially the teams that lost. You lost, and you lost big. When you dissect that, what could you have done differently?
Senator, I think about the when we were making the decisions, so the investments, and when our team made those decisions, I truly do believe that we made the best decisions
you
we
think,
could.
yeah, I only have a minute and 19 seconds left. Let's get to it. There is nothing you think you could have done differently.
Senator, if the...
No, yes or no? Is there anything you could have done differently?
If the team would have known it was going to be the
No,
fastest in race in history, I believe they would have considered different decisions.
So you still take no responsibility for any of this?
Senator, I was the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank. I take responsibility for what ultimately happened.
Okay, if you take responsibility, then will you give that $1.5 million bonus back?
Senator, as I previously said, I'm going to cooperate with the process that
But I mean, will
know is
you
gonna
do
happen.
it? You don't have to. I mean, will you do it? Let's say they say, no, you don't have to give it back. Will you give it back? Because you said you care about your 8,000 employees and their families. You say you care about everything you've put everyone through. There are CEOs in banks all across this country that are having to pay up for your mistake. You said you went to Hawaii. Did you have a chance to walk on the beach, sit on the beach? And when you did you think about what you've done to these people? And if so, will you give back the $1.5 million from your FY 2022 performance?
Senator, as I previously said, I'm committed to cooperate with the process, with the regulators and other agencies that I know are going to be looking into that specific question.
Okay, well, I hope even if for whatever reason they say you don't have to, I hope that you dig deep and you decide that that needs to be somewhere besides in your pocket. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Britt. Senator Cortez Masto, who's...
That's exactly right. Senator Graham, thank you for putting this together. Thank you for your leadership. One of the things that you touched on at the very beginning is that Democrats say we have no solutions. I guarantee you, if you take a look at this group up here, we have put forth solution after solution after solution. I mean, you look at H.R. 2 and what you're trying to move here in the Senate. You look at the work you've done. Guys, I would have never seen the border firsthand if this woman didn't know that I needed to see it immediately upon entering the United States Senate. I followed up with a trip with John Cornyn because they care. These people down there, Senator Blackburn would talk to them. She knew them. We walked through and we got to hear women tell us their story. And their stories are brutalizing. And to Senator Cruz's point, if you're not telling it, that's on you. Because when a woman sits there and she tells you not just about being raped, but how many times a day she's raped. When she tells you about having to lay in that bed while they come in and out and in and out, it's disgusting and it's despicable. Folks, you look at the number of people that have died at the border because Joe Biden has made it more and more enticing to come here. Make no mistake, this is a result of failed policies. We could fix this. We can't throw money at this and fix it. We have to actually change the policies. I looked in the eyes of CBP agents who said, we're exhausted. We're not only having to be paper pushers, we're also trying to do what we did, what we took an oath of office to do, and that is protect this border. But when they tell you about finding small children who have drowned in that river or pulling a lifeless body of a woman who is pregnant with twins, it changes the way you think about what's happening. Drug cartels, guys, they have their tentacles all over this country. We need you to start telling that story. To Senator Cruz's point, they will tell you exactly how much they paid to get here. Then they'll tell you where they're going, what their job's going to be, and how much more they owe. Got it? And guess what? Just the other day in Alabama, a gentleman told me, if you will come back here with me in this neighborhood right behind you, you will see migrants who are here illegally, and they will tell you about the drug cartels coming around every other week to collect. Guys, that's not the American dream. That's an American nightmare. We know what policies work. President Trump had secured the border. We know what to do. We just have to have a leader who has the courage to do it. And I am so sick of Joe Biden lecturing us about the soul of America. Let me tell you, he needs to have the heart to actually listen to people. He needs to have the compassion to actually hear those stories, the willingness to work with people. And Joe Biden needs the courage to take decisive action. We are standing here ready to do this, and what he put forth in that supplemental is an absolute joke. It will only facilitate this crisis more and more every day. By the end of his tenure, we will have over 10 million people here, which would make that, by the way, if you put everybody in one place, the 11th largest state in the United States of America. Folks, this is out of control. We've got to do something. We would not allow this to happen in a third world country. We certainly should not allow it to happen in the United States of America.
Because again, you have informed us you need to leave, and I want to make sure as many senators as possible have time. Senator Britt.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. I'd like to start by telling you and the Vice Chair how much we appreciate you holding this hearing. It is critically important that we have the opportunity to ask tough questions, to get answers for the American people, and to do our job. You allowing us to be here today will certainly make great strides towards that. Thank you both for being here before this committee. Before we start in on talking about some of the topics that we're here to talk about today, I want to make sure that we make a point on our border. So the national defense strategy of our nation promises that first we will defend our homeland. In order to do that, we must secure our border. When we are talking about the number of people here and the number of countries, Secretary Blinken, I'd like to add to the countries that you just said. We have people from Iran, people from Syria, people from Yemen, people from Jordan, people from Lebanon. We know the foothold that Iran has in so many of these nations. Now, these are the people that we have encountered at the border. There exists a problem that we have 1.7 million gotaways into this nation where we don't know who they are, where they're going, or what their intentions are. As we see anti-Semitic behavior rise not only across the oceans, but here in this nation, we must do every single thing that we can to keep our homeland safe, and that starts with securing our border. When we look at what's happening in Israel and the atrocities, I want to thank both of you for going and putting boots on the ground immediately, telling our friends and greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel, that we stand shoulder to shoulder with them, particularly in the face of these barbaric atrocities that occurred on October 7th. Secretary Blinken, thank you for what you just said, talking about what actually happened. I hope that every media outlet plays what you testified to earlier, and that is that we have seen men with their eyeballs gouged out. We saw children watch their parents be executed. We saw families at their breakfast table be tortured and murdered. This must stop. And in order for people in Israel to be able to tuck their children in at night, and people across this globe, we must eradicate Hamas. In doing so, we've got to take the threat of Iran seriously and what they've been doing across the globe, what they've been funding, who they have been training. You said earlier, Secretary Blinken, you agreed with Senator Graham that the normalization efforts with Saudi and Israel, that was one of the links in the chain that led us to where we are today. My question for you is, do you agree that the strategy of what I would call appeasement from this administration that occurred starting with the Obama administration now to here when it's easing off of sanctions, even offering to enter back into talks about the JCPOA, that type of behavior also contributed to where we are today?
Oops. Thank you, Senator. It won't surprise you that I wouldn't agree with that statement, even though I agree with pretty much everything you said right up to that statement. And again, I just point out that when it comes to Iran, two things very quickly. One.
And go ahead. And I know I have a limited time.
Very quickly. We've been engaged in going at Iran for its support in a whole variety of ways for malicious activities throughout the region, including support for terrorism, including destabilization. That's involved, as I said, sanctioning more than 400 Iranian entities and individuals over the last 2.5 years.
And not to cut you off, but I know that she's going to cut me off. So, you know, in order to actually do this, we have to go back to a strategy of maximum pressure. I hope you'll work with your other countries here in G7 to actually do that. Can you commit today that this administration will not resume talks to enter in with Iran to enter the JCPOA?
Well, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals about our diplomacy. I can simply say that it was a big mistake to walk away from the JCPOA, because at least it took one problem off the table, which was Iran's nuclear program. Unfortunately, since we've moved out, Iran has turned that back on. And so that just adds to the threat that Iran poses.
Obviously, we're
being able
going
to deal with
we're going to disagree on that.
One problem was a positive.
So we have one more minute. Secretary Austin, when we're looking at what is happening across the Middle East there, particularly with attacks on our troops, do you believe that Iran understands? We more recently heard this administration say that there is a red line. Do you believe that Iran understands what that red line is?
Senator Britt, we've been clear that the protection of our troops is important, and we will do what's necessary to protect them. And this activity has to change. If it doesn't change, we will respond, and again, we'll respond at a time
of our choosing. Yes, and I just want to make sure that we have we been clear with Iran what that red line is? Do they understand that?
We have been clear about what I just said, Senator Britt.
Okay.
Thank you. Senator Manchin.
Thank you. Thank you both for your testimony.
Senator Britt.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you both secretaries for being here today. I want to start by acknowledging the sentiments of many of my colleagues about the urgent need for border security, for policy changes, and to changes in interior enforcement. I just want to take a minute to ask a couple of questions. I'm going to start, Secretary Mayorkas, when you testified on March 29th before the Homeland Security Subcommittee regarding President's FY24 budget proposal for your department, there were 6,610 encounters at the southern border. On Monday, that number was 8,500, which is 8.5 times more than the 1,000 daily encounters that your former boss, Secretary Jay Johnson, said would constitute a crisis. I know on that day, on March 29th, you did not say that we had a crisis. My question for you is today, do you believe that we have a crisis before us?
Senator, let me make this point that is very, very important, because I've been asked, would I describe it as a disaster? Would I describe it as a crisis? I do not diminish the significance and the complexity of the challenge. No, if I may.
Well, I only have 5 minutes and I only have 3 left. So is it a crisis, yes or not? I guess I'm going to move on. Secretary Bashara, do you think that we have a child care crisis, affordable child care crisis in this country?
Senator, I don't think there's any doubt that we
okay,
have
that's what I thought. Okay, so, but this is an emergency, Secretary Mayorkas. It is an emergency, though.
It is urgent that we receive the funding for our personnel and our tools to enhance the security of our border.
I think we just need to use the words "it's true." It's an emergency. That's what this administration said. They put it in an emergency supplemental request. So let's treat it as such. Moving on, you did have a record year, though, in other ways. You put more people on the non-detained docket than previous 2 administrations combined in the entirety of their terms in office. This administration had near low levels of removal and detention beds filled, and this administration set another record for encounters on the southwest border. And as my colleague from New Hampshire mentioned, there was a 500% increase in the northern border in a 5-county area that impacts the area that she represents. When we talk about this, we don't need to manage the border, as it says in one of your requests here. We actually need to secure it. So in doing that, this administration has kind of had different positions, and I want to clarify it. Do you believe that a border wall is part of the answer? Yes or no?
No.
No. Okay, so I have a trouble reconciling that with your the rule that you signed and issued on October 5th, where you said construction of physical barriers on the border of the United States would, in fact, prevent unlawful entries.
Senator, so if I may explain, the Congress mandated that we employ
But you didn't actually have to issue a rule. We could have done that. And one more thing,
That is
this
incorrect.
administration and your department, the Department of Homeland Security, issued a contract for $500,000 in September of 2001 for the purchase and installation of a wall around this president's beach house. So you'll do know walls work. You do know they're part of the solution. You do know they're part of creating security. But for whatever reason, you feel like the American people are beneath that. And I think that it is incredibly frustrating. I only have a minute left, so I want to move to interior enforcement. When you're looking at the non-detained docket, I'm concerned about the growth of the number of people in the interior who are waiting years, if not decades, to have their cases heard before an immigration judge. So particularly if you look at this, the ICE officers, do we have the number of officers needed? Do they have the support that they are needed in order to manage this caseload of 6.3 million individuals and rising? So now with 40 seconds left, do you, when we have, let's see, the 1 million people that have had due process and need to be removed, do you believe that the ICE officers have what they need to be able to remove those?
Senator, as our supplemental reflects, we need more enforcement and removal operations officers. We need more support staff for them. Despite the constraint of inadequate resources, we have removed aggravated felons at a higher rate than the prior administration. We have interdicted.
I only have
fentanyl.
17 seconds left, but you've only requested 45 more ICE officers. And the truth is, when you look at the 6,000 officers that we have and the 6.5 million people that are in the interior and the 1 million people that need to be removed, you're asking each of these agents to essentially, you've got to remove about 167 people if we were going to remove all 1 million in a year. We've got to be serious about what we're requesting. Y'all requested this 2 years ago, and either you aren't serious about it or my colleagues across the aisle didn't want to fund it, because those 45 officers that you requested did not make it into the omnibus bill. I am hopeful that we not only have the 45 that were requested, but we have much more. They have an important job to do, and we need to make sure they have the resources and the officers to do it. Thank you.
I would be pleased to speak with you.